This past spring, millions of Canadians opened their banking app and found money they never asked for. $49.11. No message, no reason. If you'd accepted an offer years earlier, your deposit was smaller, $24 and change. It wasn't a rebate, it wasn't a gift, it was a receipt. That deposit closed the books on something that ran for 14 years. Between 2001 and 2015, the price of the plainest thing in your cart, a loaf of packaged bread, was nudged upward on a schedule. Investigators later laid out the rhythm in almost dull detail. About 7 cents added at the warehouse, 10 on the shelf, roughly twice a year for a decade and a half. The empire at the center of it eventually paid $500 million to make the lawsuits stop. That is why the money surfaced in your account in 2026. Not a kind gesture, but the bill for getting caught.
And here is the detail worth pausing on. The company cutting those checks is not hurting. In 2024, it rang up more than $61 billion in sales, close to $15 billion in one 3-month stretch alone. So this stopped being a story about bread a long time ago. The real question is this: how did a company that spent 50 years calling itself Canada's store become the name this country trusts the least? And is that distrust just a feeling, or did they earn it, one line item at a time? Stick with me, because the $49 check is a distraction. The real money was never at the cash register. It's buried in a ledger most of us have never opened, under the one thing Loblaws owns that's worth more than the food: the ground the stores are built on. This is Loblaws. For most of 2 decades, Loblaws owned something no balance sheet could buy: a face the country believed. If you were here any time after 2007, you know him. Galen Weston Jr., strolling through strawberry rows, holding up produce like a neighbor proud of his garden. He never played the billionaire. He played the decent guy down the block who drove something sensible and honestly seemed to care whether your dinner was any good. It worked so well that the whole country formed a kind of friendship with a man almost none of them had met, and that warmth did something useful for the business. It made the sheer size of the thing disappear. Here's what the gentle ads never said when you got fed up and drove to the cheaper store to escape their prices. No frills. You were shopping at a banner Loblaw owns. Zehrs, real Canadian superstore. Theirs, your independent grocer, whose name is practically a promise that it isn't one. Also theirs. Every exit door led back into the same building. For years, nobody minded, because the face was kind and the bill was bearable. But a mask only lasts until it slips, and when this one finally did, it slipped over something as ordinary as a loaf of bread. The scandal we opened on. That was the moment a lot of people looked again at the friendly man in the commercial and started wondering what was standing behind him. To see the machine, you have to rewind to before the machine, to an idea that was genuinely good. In 1919, in Toronto, 2 men, Theodore Loblaw and J. Milton Cork, tried something that sounds obvious now and was radical then. Back then, a clerk fetched your order from the back while you waited at a counter. Loblaw and Cork built a store where you walked the aisles and filled your own basket. They called it a groceteria. Dropping the clerk dropped the cost. Cheaper prices pulled crowds, bigger crowds meant bigger buying power, and the prices dropped again. Theodore became known as the Merchant Prince, running well over 100 stores across Ontario and into New York State before he died. Then the bakers arrived. George Weston had turned bread and biscuits into a small fortune, and his son Garfield wanted more than a bakery. Starting in 1947, he quietly bought up Loblaw stock, and by the early 50s, the Weston family controlled the company outright. Over the decades that followed, they absorbed rival after rival: National Grocers, Zehrs, eventually Shoppers Drug Mart, until one family sat on top of a national giant. Read that founding trick closely, because it runs for the next century. The edge that built the first store was never really about food. It was about finding a cost everyone else just accepted, cutting it out, and keeping the difference. The Westons inherited that instinct, and once the empire grew too big to run like a corner shop, they aimed it somewhere new.
They stopped thinking like people who sell food and started thinking like people who own the ground it's sold on. This is where the grocery story stops being a grocery story. Whenever executives get called to Parliament, they recite a version of the same line. Our margins are razor thin. We barely keep a few pennies on a dollar of produce. On the narrow question of the aisle, that's true. But nobody builds a $60 billion empire on the markup of a banana. The real engine sits one floor up in a company called Choice Properties, a real estate trust that owns hundreds of commercial sites and stands among the largest landlords in the entire country. A trust like that is simple. It owns buildings and collects rent. The detail that changes everything is the identity of its single biggest tenant. In Choice's own filings, that tenant is Loblaws, supplying somewhere around 57% of the trust's rental income. So follow the loop. Loblaws wants fatter profit without looking greedy in front of furious shoppers and even angrier politicians. The trust raises the rent. Loblaws then points at that rent, says its costs are climbing, and tells you milk has to go up too. Rent rises, your bill rises, and the landlord banking that rent is, for every practical purpose, the same empire paying it. That's the quiet engine, and it has a job. It moves money out of the grocery business, where every price gets photographed and every margin gets dragged before a committee, and into the real estate business, where the profit rests undisturbed. Call it asset optimization, the polite phrase for making $1 look thin in this pocket and thick in that one. When a Weston swears the company keeps about $1 on your basket, he's telling the truth about the aisle while saying nothing about the rent check he wrote to himself. And you can see it in the paperwork. Choice's 2024 report openly books lease surrender payments and site intensification fees from Loblaw, millions moving between two arms of one body. But the land does more than hide profit. It blocks rivals. For years, the big chains buried restrictive covenants and exclusive use clauses into their leases, legal terms that keep a competing grocer, a dollar store, or a pharmacy from opening on nearby land, sometimes for decades. Picture what that does to a neighborhood. A family wants to open an independent shop across from a Loblaw-owned store, and the deed itself forbids it, because paperwork signed years earlier walled that ground off from competition. The shopper never sees the clause. They just notice the one big store has no rival, and its prices never feel any reason to fall. That's the moat, and it's not a metaphor. In 2024, the Competition Bureau opened formal investigations into Loblaw and Empire over exactly these property controls. Strip away the aprons and the flyers and the smiling ads, and the shape underneath is plain. The real asset was never the food. It was the leases. Which makes the next part strange, because a company this well-defended kept reaching for something far riskier. If that's how the empire treats its customers, it saves the real pressure for whoever fills the shelves. Early in 2022, shoppers hit the snack aisle and found a strange yellow gap where Lay's and Doritos used to sit. Loblaw and Frito-Lay were at war. The supplier wanted a price increase to cover its own rising costs. Loblaw refused and let the shelves go empty rather than blink. For weeks, the country watched a live lesson in who really calls the shots in Canadian grocery. And that upper hand keeps inventing new fees. On top of old charges for shelf space, the giants began billing suppliers to unload their own trucks and to fund the grocer's marketing. In 2020, Loblaws simply told its suppliers about a new 1.2% charge on everything they shipped, money set aside to pay for Loblaw's own online shopping upgrade. Read that twice. The suppliers were being asked to bankroll the very machine built to squeeze them. Then, in 2013, the empire reached past your fridge and into your medicine cabinet. It bought Shoppers Drug Mart for $12.5 billion. Suddenly, the same company selling you sugary cereal was handing you your insulin. And for millions of Canadians without a family doctor, that pharmacy counter was the closest thing to healthcare they had. And the counter got sales targets. Pharmacists have alleged that head office set quotas on a public program called MedsCheck, government-paid medication reviews meant to keep patients safe. Ontario pays as much as $75 a call for those reviews, nearly double what a family doctor earns for a visit. Staff say they were pushed to phone people who didn't need one just to bill for it. and a former Shoppers owner has filed a proposed class action over it. The last piece is the quietest. Loblaws runs PC Optimum, the most used loyalty program in the country, more than 15 million members. Every scan is a diary entry. Buy diapers, and they can guess there's a new baby. Buy cough syrup, and they can guess someone's sick. Lay your grocery list over your shopper's prescription history, and Loblaws holds a portrait of your household that your own government doesn't have. What do you do with a portrait like that? You find the exact price that each person hesitates, and the exact price they'll pay anyway. So the discount was never really a gift. It's a measurement. The company learning the least it can hand you, and still keep you walking back in. And leaving isn't clean either. In 2026, the Federal Privacy Commissioner found Loblaws had held on to members' purchase histories even after they deleted their accounts, with anonymization loose enough that the records could be traced back to real people. The picture outlives your consent, your body, and your budget sitting in one file. This is so new, the law is only now catching up. In March of 2026, Manitoba became the first province in Canada to move against what critics call surveillance pricing, charging you more because an algorithm decided you'd tolerate it. When a province has to write a brand new law just to say, don't price people by how desperate they are, you know how far the game had already gone. Here's where a fair viewer pushes back. Every company chases profit. Landlords raise rent. Stores read data. Maybe Loblaws is simply good at business, and we're just bitter. So let's do the thing they're betting we won't. Measure Canada against the rest of the world. In Canada, the big three, Loblaws, Sobeys, and Metro, control nearly 60% of the grocery market. And once you add Walmart and Costco, 5 companies control about 80% of it. In the United States, the 3 biggest chains hold barely a third. So when you feel like there's nowhere else to shop, that isn't paranoia, it's arithmetic. Canadians live inside one of the most concentrated grocery markets in the developed world. And concentration matters less when there's a referee. Britain has one. In 2013, the UK set up an independent groceries code adjudicator, a regulator that can investigate the giants and actually fine them for abusing suppliers. Canada's version is a voluntary code the biggest players only agreed to sign in 2024, with no power to fine anyone. Same disease, opposite medicine. And we're not even the only ones. In Australia, where Woolworths and Coles together control about 2/3 of the market, the competition regulator dragged both chains into court over discounts it called misleading. Around the world, the same duopoly problem is being fought in courtrooms. In Canada, it took a subreddit. Which brings us at last to a photograph. In January 2023, a shopper in Toronto snapped a tray of 5 chicken breasts ringing in at $37 and posted it. Overnight, it became a national symbol. Proof, people felt, that the system had quit working. Families choosing between rent and dinner, staring at a basic protein priced like a luxury. The industry's reply was always one word: inflation, supply chains, the war overseas. We're only passing the costs along. But an economist named Jim Sanford at the Center for Future Work ran the real figures. Grocery profit didn't just track inflation, it outran it. Across the sector, net margins climbed from roughly 1.5% before the pandemic to nearly 3% after, and total profit more than doubled, from about $2.5 billion a year towards $6 billion. There's a word for that. Economists call it greedflation, seller's inflation. And the trick is almost insultingly simple. If your real costs rise 5%, you raise the price 8%. The extra 3 points vanish into the general panic because everyone's already braced to pay more. Chaos makes the perfect cover. The whole bet was that the average shopper wouldn't run the numbers. The $37 chicken was the day the country finally ran them. For a long time, Canadians did the most Canadian thing there is. They grumbled and paid. Then in 2024, the patience broke. It began on a subreddit with a blunt name: Loblaws is out of control. A wall of photos of $12 butter and $9 chips. It swelled past 50,000 members, turned into a swap meet for cheaper independents, and voted to boycott every Loblaws-owned store for the month of May. People canceled their PC Optimum cards, moved prescriptions out of Shoppers, and drove out of their way to Giant Tiger and the local market. Loblaws tried to wave it off. At the annual meeting, Galen Weston dismissed the anger as misguided and reached again for the old script about thin margins and a hard world. This time, it didn't take. The memes turned genuinely dark, theft reframed as Robin Hood justice, and once the public decides that stealing from you is fair, you've lost something no ad can buy back. So, the empire changed the face in front of the machine. Galen Weston stepped back from daily control and brought in a Danish retail veteran, Per Bank, with one clear assignment: fix the reputation. Bank moved fast on the headline items. He signed the grocery code of conduct the company had spent years refusing and pledged to drop the restrictive land deals that kept rivals out. But look hard at what he actually surrendered. The code and the covenants were the cheapest chips on the table. The self-dealing real estate trust still stands. The Shoppers and PC Optimum data engine still runs on 15 million households. The vertical integration, one family owning the supplier, the store, and the shelf, sits completely untouched. His job was reputation, not repair. An outsider hired to repaint the wall, not rebuild the house behind it. And here's the twist the empire didn't plan for. By pushing prices this high, Loblaws may have revived its own competition. The independent grocer, the local butcher, the farm box, options people once wrote off as luxuries are suddenly, in a lot of towns, cheaper than the supermarket. The state is moving too. The Competition Bureau is now formally investigating those land deals. And in 2023, Ottawa rewrote federal competition law, stripping out the old merger defense that let giants justify a deal by calling it efficient. So, does Loblaws deserve to be the least trusted grocer in the country? Look at the ledger. A 14-year bread scheme that ended in the biggest antitrust check Canada has ever written. A landlord quietly renting to itself. A pharmacy run on quotas. A loyalty card that remembers you after you've gone. And profit that outran inflation while the ads talked about strawberries. The distrust isn't a mood, it's a conclusion. For 50 years, the promise was that this was Canada's store, a partner in your daily life. But a partner doesn't wall off the land so nothing else can grow. And a partner doesn't bill the landlord to collect rent from itself. Sooner or later, you stop asking whether you're a valued customer and start asking whether you were ever more than a number they were quietly optimizing. And be specific. Name the one price this year that made you put the item back on the shelf. Next time, we leave the checkout line for a very different Canadian story. A company that once held the entire future in the palm of your hand, right up until the world quietly closed its fist and moved on without it. Until then, stay sharp.